LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Chris Johnstone, who joins us to discuss his recent book, Active Hope: How to Face the Mess We're In Without Going Crazy. Co-authored with Joanna Macy, Active Hope is about finding and offering our best response to the crisis of sustainability unfolding in our world. It starts by accepting that the challenges we face can be difficult even to look at. Climate change, the depletion of oil, economic collapse, and the dieback of our natural world act together to create a planetary emergency of overwhelming proportions. Active Hope offers an approach that strengthens our capacity to face disturbing information and respond with unexpected resilience and creative power. Hello and welcome, Chris Johnstone, and thank you very much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Pleasure, Greg. Good to talk with you.
Now we're here today to discuss your relatively new book that you have co-authored, and it's called Active Hope: How to Face the Mess We're In Without Going Crazy. Fairly self-explanatory title, but perhaps before we dive into that, perhaps you could give the listeners some background of you and your work and the journey that you've been on that's brought you to the work that you do today, and how the book came about.
Yes, certainly. Well, my background, I trained as a medical doctor and psychologist and worked for nearly 20 years in the UK health service as an addiction specialist. And my core interest, and has been really for decades, is the psychology of change, and particularly what helps us rise to the occasion when we're facing challenges. And I've worked for more than 20 years with Joanna Macy, an American writer, workshop leader and activist who's now in her 80s. And Joanna, over 30 years ago, in the late 1970s, she developed an empowerment approach that's called the Work That Reconnects. And the goal of this is really to help enliven and empower responses to the global crisis we face. And she's been a really big influence on me. And what I've been delighted about and feel a sense of privilege around really is that I've worked very closely with her over the 4 years that we worked on producing this book. She living in the States and me living in Britain. And we had a long series of Skype conversations. We actually had over 100 hours of conversation over Skype. And through that, we wrote this book together.
Okay. Now, the book itself, I personally picked it up because deeply concerned about the direction that we've been going in as a species and what we're doing to the planet. I've probably been like that all my life, to be honest, but things are not getting better. And there's a lot of literature out there warning us of a bazillion different things that are out of control and going wrong. There's a lot less literature that's offering some light at the end of the tunnel, a way out, a way to deal with things. And Active Hope, which I thoroughly enjoyed reading, by the way, is a really useful tool, much needed, I think, in these times, to give people the encouragement to do something, however little it is, but just to take steps forward and not just exist in what you in the book call the deadened response to the global crisis, which is a great danger in itself, because it causes us to do nothing. And I suppose the message of the book is summed up in the title. It's not just hope, it's active hope.
Exactly that. That there are different ways of thinking about hope, and one way of thinking about hope is in terms of probability. It's an assessment of the likelihood of things going the way we want them to. So we feel hopeful about a situation if we think it's likely to go well, and unhopeful if we're less optimistic. And a lot of people look at global issues and don't feel at all optimistic about how things are going. But even more so, the Mental Health Foundation did a big survey of over 2,000 people looking at their emotional responses to global issues. And the commonest response was a sense of powerlessness, that people look at what's going on and feel like there's nothing I can do, nothing I can do that's really going to make much difference. And when people feel powerless like that, there's a sense of resignation, closing down and closing off to the situation. And so what really Joanna's work has been about, and my work too, is when we face disturbing information, when we face information that's depressing to look at, rather than weighing up the chances of are we hopeful or are we not, there's another side of hope, the second side of hope, which is really about what do we hope for? What do we desire? What is it we long for? What is it we hope will happen? And you see that as setting your navigational coordinates. You see that as setting the direction to move in. And then the next question is, what can I do to move that way? So we think of active hope as having three main stages. The first stage is to take in a clear view of reality. So you're just seeing things as they are, both the fantastic, wonderful aspects and also the disturbing ones. And then the second step is just to say, what do I hope for? How do I hope things will go? But then also, and then this is the real key, the third part is about being an active participant in the story of helping that to happen. And when we do that, we have no guarantee that it will all work out well. But what we can know is that we're putting the full weight of our lives behind the outcome that we prefer will happen. Putting the weight of our lives behind our preferred version of the future.
Yes, well, people tend to forget that if you choose not to decide, you've still made a choice, and that we do make choices every day, and so some of those are to do nothing. And when you realize that, that life isn't certain, it's just uncertainty, that can be quite empowering as well. And you can then start to make choices consciously, because either way, as you say in the book, the situation that we're in, we encourage people to look at realistically, it is happening. And, so it's a case of how you face up to it and how you deal with it. Exactly
that. And I think one of the things we write about is that there are different ways of looking at what's going on, and we think of them as different stories we can tell ourselves about how things are on planet Earth at the beginning of the 21st century. And one story is that things are going fine, and really what we need is to get the economy to grow even bigger and to get more jobs and higher salaries and economic development. And that is the dominant story amongst certainly most world leaders, corporate leaders, that business as usual story. And the defining assumption is that we don't really need to change the way we're going. We just kind of need more of the same and to do it better and faster. And that's what's it's basically leading us over the edge of a cliff. This idea that we need to have economic growth where the more we grow, the more resources we consume and the more waste we produce, without really looking at, well, what are the limits to that? That basically we're entering an age where we're already most of the cheaper, more available oil has already been used up, and what we're left with is the oil that's difficult to get hold of, that might be miles beneath the ocean surface, or or poorer quality oil like the tar sands in Canada, and there's plenty of other resources that we're coming to the limits of, but also just the more we grow, the more waste we produce. And I think that the amount of waste produced, for example, in North America each year would produce equivalent to rows of rubbish trucks going around the world several times. I mean, it's just absolutely astounding the amount of rubbish that we produce. But also, we don't really know what to do with it. We're creating so much. But as well as the rubbish we can see, there's a rubbish that we can't see in terms of the waste products that we're pumping out into the atmosphere, the carbon dioxide, tons every year for each person, certainly in Western Europe and North America. And I mean, the idea that we need to grow more in a way that's producing more waste products that are destabilizing the climate. I mean, it's kind of like we're just not looking at where we're heading. That we're increasingly becoming dominated by a very, very short-term approach to thinking, and certainly when it comes to economic transactions, they're now occurring even in matters of seconds. This idea of automated trading of shares happening, shares can be bought and sold in a matter of seconds, not even by humans, but by controlled by computer programs, governed by very, very short-term decisions are made on basically what's going to make profit between the morning and the afternoon. I once spoke to somebody who's an economist for one of the major banks in the City of London, and she was in their long-range planning department. And long-range planning for them was looking as far ahead as 3 months in the future. And how can we navigate in a world where the consequences of our decisions can last, not just decades or even hundreds of years, but, for example, with some of the toxins we're producing, they have effects that will still be around even hundreds of millions of years into the future. I mean, it's just a completely different span of time. So if the consequences of our decisions are long-term, but we're only looking at the short-term consequences for actually making the decisions, what's happening is we're blinding ourselves to the hazards that we're heading into. And I think of it as just like the Titanic, really. The Titanic was, the problem is it was at too great a speed to slow down when it finally saw the hazards that it was crashing into. And we're in real danger of operating on a very similar kind of principle, but as our whole human society.
Yeah, this short-termism is kind of manifesting itself not only, in a greater quantity, if you want to put it that way, but it's right across the board now. We've spoken about, financial institutions, corporations, governments, all just thinking about tomorrow or next week or from one election to the next. And, you look at the negotiations around the world and all different bodies and, some governmental, some non-governmental, addressing problems, but they're not really addressing them at all. It's like what's going on with the euro right now. They're kicking the can down the road. And you see this all the way down through the different levels of society, right down to individuals. I mean, I don't know about you, but the people in my life, friends and family, there's not so much planning for the future. People feel uncertain. They realize that things are uncertain. They stop financial planning because they feel they can't. People are not building for the future. It doesn't mean they're not living their lives, and perhaps there's things that they want to do or that they're working towards. But the idea of a real coherent vision for the future, they're just preferring not to think about it and say, let's just get through this month. Let's just get to Christmas. Let's just get to the summer and see what things are like when we get there.
And I think how very different, I'm just thinking of the Haudenosaunee, are native people from North America, and known very much for their seventh generation question, that when they met in council to consider important questions, important issues, one of the questions they'd ask is, how will this decision affect the seventh generation? And I'm just wondering what would happen if we had that change in thinking. And I think this also really is linked to our whole view of reality and our view of what we are. That if we see ourselves as separate individuals, then what happens beyond the span of our own lives has less meaning to us. And certainly I think parents or grandparents, there is a sense of wanting to consider what's going to happen for the next generation or the generation after that. But exactly as you say, that there's a kind of narrowing of timescape, the timescape being the boundaries of time that we consider, looking back and looking forward, is shrinking. That what's seen to be important is what's just happened, what's happening and what's about to happen, without seeing ourselves in a larger landscape of time that goes back, that we are part of a wonderful living Earth. That's our planet's about 4.5 billion years old, and life on this planet has been around for about 3.5 billion years. When we start to think of ourselves as part of a planet, when we start to think of ourselves as part of the living superorganism of life on Earth, we start to enter a very different conception of time.
Do you think that, because I've stopped, quite some time ago, stopped paying any attention to the mainstream media, but when I do hear sort of proclamations from politicians and leaders of various types, I do wonder, you talk in the book about the social pressure that often keeps us from talking about difficult subjects. I mean, we all know how that works with our personal lives, things we just don't want to talk about, sweep under the carpet. But it's true of the global issues that we're facing. And do you believe that the leaders and the great and the good, the people in charge, so to speak, are under the same, a form of that pressure? Obviously, there appears to be some, malevolent, malignant agendas at work, but I do wonder when I look at them, do they really have to just get up and lie through their teeth because it will be unacceptable socially to speak the truth?
I think that we have a real difficult situation here. I mean, there's studies looking at speeches of politicians, and the ones who are more likely to win are those who appear to be more optimistic. So if you have somebody who's promising, it will be better under me, it will be rosier under me, that's very attractive to people. They think, oh yeah, that person, they've got confidence in their vision. But honesty is not rewarded in mainstream politics. And even the idea of changing your mind, that when you become aware of new information and you need to change your mind, and I teach courses on resilience, and I see that flexibility where you're and responding to feedback, where you can change course when you become aware of new information that shows you're off course, those are essential for resilience, yet they are basically selected against in mainstream politics. If people are too honest, or if they own up to changing their mind, they're accused of weakness and of having a U-turn.
I think it's one of the key aspects, no guarantee perhaps, but one of the key aspects to like having a long life and to having, continuing to enjoy life right up until the moment it ceases, is the ability to take on new information, to absorb it, and to, as you say, change course if it's relevant to do so, if it's the right thing to do. And I see a lot of people get fixed ideas about particular things. Nope, this is the way it is. That politician's a good guy. This system, I like it. I voted for it. I bought into this. Whether people have committed money or time or just their belief to something, they can be very resistant to that because they identify with their beliefs, and then they feel that whether a politician, that they're doing a U-turn. If they're an individual, they think they're flim-flamming, that people will think that they don't know what they think. What's your opinion on this? And if you change your opinion, then your original one was somehow invalid, and your new one is even more invalid.
Yes, and I think it's something about how we approach thinking skills and this idea of feedback, being open to feedback. And I'm very sensitive to this because I spent so many years working as an addiction specialist, where one of the real problems is where somebody has difficulty facing what's going on, and alcohol, particularly I work with people with alcohol problems, is often used as a way of blotting out what's difficult. And so what you have is you get a vicious cycle where there's a situation that's difficult, it's like, oh my God, I can't face this, I want to have a drink. So you have a drink and you blot it out, and the problem goes in the short term, but it comes back with interest. So you have another drink, you blot it out, the problem goes, but it comes back with interest. And that same vicious spiral can be seen to happen at lots of different levels, including in organisations. And there's lots being written about some of the financial organisations that closed down to feedback, that even though they had very clear signals that they were heading the wrong way, that there were things that happening that were really needed to be addressed, there was a sort of group culture where it was unacceptable to rock the boat by naming what was going on, that kind of groupthink, and kind of closing down to feedback. And what happened is the organisation just went more and more and more off course, that something that could have been nipped in the bud at an earlier stage just wasn't dealt with and just grew completely out of control. And I see that happening on a larger societal basis as well, that many of the issues we face, if we really put our minds and hearts to addressing them, we certainly could. But what's happening is that the idea of addressing them is seen to be too much of a cost. It's seen to be too much of a loss. It's seen to be an uncomfortable, unpopular, and even the idea of political suicide, the idea that if a politician is too open about the problems we face, they'll be seen as somehow unelectable. And I think this is that we are trapping ourselves into, it becomes a situation where the worse things get, the more difficult they become to face. But the more difficult they become to face, the more we close off to them, then the worse that they will get.
Well, we do have a culture of shooting the messenger, don't we? And we see that with whistleblowers. I don't have a strong opinion either way about someone like Julian Assange, because I don't feel that I have the facts. You know, I don't believe anything. I either know it or I don't know it, and I don't know in his case. But however, we see that people who do go out on a limb to make a difference, if you can't ridicule them, then quite often they're taken out, you know, physically or metaphorically.
Absolutely, yes. And I had the experience of that myself. I worked in the health service as a junior doctor years ago, and there was a culture of junior doctors working crazy hours. I mean, I would sometimes work well over 100 hours in a week. Sometimes I think I worked 135 hours in a week. But the idea that your future jobs depended on your references from your employers, and if you spoke out, you would become unemployable. And I remember that I was asked to be interviewed by a TV news team, and because it was on the hospital, outside the hospital, the managers of the hospital were told, and I got phoned at home the evening before the interview by one of the hospital managers and told that if I went ahead with this interview, I would need to watch out for my future.
Yeah, it's quite very insidious. But to put things on a positive spin, which is ultimately what we're about today, you do, quite early on in the book, address the fear that we all have at some level that we're not up to the task, that, even though the large organizations, and governments are manifestly failing and quite often are the cause of the problems, we still want to leave it to them, in quotes, to sort out. And there's a really good section in the book, and basically to say that, it's not just little me, that actually we're all part of something much bigger. We're sort of like cells in a body, that we're part of a system here, and that one person can make a difference. And that when you start to do something, then sort of serendipity and synchronicity starts to come into play, and things can really begin to move.
Yes, it's a very different story. And I think of it as a story of being plugged in, being plugged into life. And I'm very interested in new approaches in science, this idea particularly in holistic science, that the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And we can all see this happening in our lives, that a cell is more than just a pile of molecules, an organ is more than just a pile of cells, and people are so much more than just piles of organs, that there's amazing things that happen in people that don't happen with just disconnected separate organs. And one of my frustrations training as a doctor is that we were taught a reductionist approach. The reductionism is that you understand something just by looking at its tiny pieces. And that view of reality is so current in mainstream education, this idea that you have a different department in a university to study each different little bit of the earth. Whereas the idea of holistic science is that you look at things as a whole. And when you look at a whole person, you see that they have abilities that you don't just see in the parts themselves. So, for example, a whole person has self-healing potential, that we have a wonderful immune system, we have an ability to resist infection. And when you work with a person as a whole, you can, rather than just focusing on the sickness and the things that are going wrong, you can also work with somebody to strengthen their body's ability, their whole person's ability to resist illness. Now, that same idea that the whole is more than the sum of the parts, you can apply to the whole of the planet. And a new approach in science, Gaia theory, looks at how all of life acts with its environment to maintain its own balance. And the research for this and evidence behind this is pretty compelling. Just something for simple as when you take a breath in, we just take for granted what's there. But the atmospheres on Mars and Venus are very, very different. And the reason they're different is because they don't have life on those planets. On Earth, we have over 20% oxygen, which basically we wouldn't have over 20% oxygen if there wasn't life playing a role in maintaining the atmosphere. Oxygen is a highly reactive chemical. It would be used up in fires and things like that. To actually have this high level is a product of the complexity and amazingness of life. And we take all of that for granted. Now, this idea of holistic science, well, we really get the idea that just as our bodies have a self-healing potential, so also you can see forests, for example, have an ability to grow back after fires, that many ecosystems can restore themselves after trauma, and the Earth itself, there have been a number of mass extinction events in the past where life has recovered from afterwards. Now, what would it be like if we were to see ourselves as part of the self-healing potential of the planet? That if we were to see ourselves like cells within a larger body, that just as white cells within your body can play a role in fighting disease, so maybe we could be, it's something about being in alignment, moving in the same direction as the ability of the planet to heal itself. And there's some very interesting things happen here about power, because it's a very different model of power. It's not like I control something or I make something happen. It's more about how do we allow larger currents of life energy to act through us. And this is really a more is where science and spirituality start to talk in a similar language, really. I don't know how this is sounding to you, Greg, this idea that just as a body can act as a larger whole, that it's not just like so many different separate pieces, that acting together it can keep itself in balance, that the idea the whole Earth can keep itself in balance. And what's been happening with humanity over the last, certainly, 50 to 100 years is that we've been going in the wrong direction. We've been pushing against the planet's balancing kind of mechanisms, but we could change. We could say, I want to go in the same direction as the rest of life. I want to play a part in protecting life. I want to be aligned with the desire of life to continue.
Yes, it's like they made themselves gods and now God has forsaken us, as they say in King Arthur. But you have a chapter in the book, a couple actually in particular, that the titles are very intriguing. And chapter 3, for example, is called Coming from Gratitude. Chapter 4 is Honouring Our Pain for the World. And these are ones that I dived into almost straight away because the titles were intriguing. And they're about, Coming from Gratitude really is about a different way of thinking. Some of the subtitles in the chapter are Promoting Well-Being, Increasing Trust and Generosity, and as an antidote to consumerism. So perhaps we just say something about that chapter.
Yes. I mean, what the empowerment approach that Joanna Macy developed in the late 1970s and the way it's evolved since then involves this idea that we can take a journey round a spiral of 4 different areas, and we can do this just even over a few minutes, or we can do it over a weekend workshop, or we can do it over a period of months. But moving through these 4 areas is strengthening in a way that resources ourselves to better respond to global crisis. And the first part of that spiral is gratitude, the idea that gratitude is one of the most amazing forces in the universe. It's something that we can switch on in an instant. We can, just in terms of the questions that we ask ourselves or what we give attention to, there's these 2 sides of gratitude. One is appreciation, so that's what we're grateful for. And the other is about the people or entities who played a role, who we're grateful to. So there's what we're grateful for, who we're grateful to. And when we think about those, gratitude, it points our attention outwards beyond ourselves to those that we receive from. And that's incredibly strengthening. That it's almost like the opposite of paranoia in a way. You know, paranoia is the feeling of the world being against you, but when you spend time giving attention to gratitude, you become aware of how much we receive from the world around us. And some cultures, I mentioned North American Indian cultures, they really build thanksgiving and gratitude into their whole way of life. You know, they have long Thanksgiving ceremonies that it's not just like one Thanksgiving day a year, but it's something that they will give a lot of time and attention to, because they see it as essential for survival. They see gratitude as really like the starting point, that if you're grateful for what supports you to live, then you don't mess it around. You know, that if we really see how much we depend on the rest of life and we felt gratitude towards the rest of life, we wouldn't ravage it, we wouldn't destroy it in the way that we are.
Now, you mentioned the Native Americans there, and they also get a mention in the section Honouring Our Pain for the World, because we have visions in our mind of Indigenous people as being, you know, as they generally are, much more in touch with their connection to nature, all of nature, you know, the seasons, time, long stretches of time, you know, behind them and in front of them, and what they do affects everything. And so perhaps you could explain the idea. I think I should say the idea that we, for example, living in the rich industrialized West, don't have that within us is false. We do feel it if we allow ourselves to feel it. We are distressed if we can face it. So in that sense, we're no different than any other human beings on the planet, but we've become so detached from the rest of existence, basically. And in your section, Honouring Our Pain for the World, I mean, there's an expression in there, working with our despair, and this kind of does what it says on the tin. It's a way to face this and allow ourselves to feel what is there.
Yes. I find very helpful the idea that we feel what we feel, but we have choices about how we respond to how we feel. And that within Western culture as a whole, there's a common idea that some feelings are basically bad and unwelcome and taboo, and they're seen as negative feelings, and this idea that basically if people feel them, they should hide them away. And so if we watch the news and we feel sad, or we feel guilty, or we feel angry, that those feelings are unwelcome. They're not things that we're encouraged to talk about, and so they get stuffed to the back of our minds and the bottom of our hearts. And this idea of honouring our pain for the world is this idea that our feelings have value. They carry signals that tell us, that carry important information. So, for example, you know, if you put your finger over a flame, it hurts. That pain alerts you to danger, and you respond to that pain by pulling it away. If we were to uneath ourselves to pain, and this happens medically sometimes with there's something called Charcot joint, where people lose pain sensation in their joints, and they can't feel when their joints are stretched too far, and they end up damaging their joints, sometimes beyond repair. And something similar is happening in our world. It's like we're not feeling the pain of our world being stretched too far. And because of that, we continue stretching, and we overstress in a way where we destroy whole environments. This idea of honouring our pain for the world, when you honour something, you hold it in high regard, you value it, you welcome it. And so, for example, if you watch disturbing news and you feel upset, angry, guilty, despairing, rather than brush those feelings away or hide them away, or, you know, pretend to be kind of spray on happiness, whatever it is, you just feel what you feel and also make room for it. But there's also, you're telling yourself a different story about that pain. And this idea of feedback. Feedback is when you pay attention to signals that tell you whether you're on course or off course. And we feel pain about situations when they're off course in some way. So, we are off course as a species. And if we listen to the signals that tell us we're off course and respond to those, then that helps us get back on course. And so that's really honouring our pain for the world, is saying that our pain for the world, when we feel upset, when we feel distressed for something beyond our personal selves, that's a signal, first of all, that we're plugged in, second, that we care, but also it's a signal that there's a situation going on that requires our response.
Now, cutting-edge science is telling us what certain, peoples of the world have known forever. And that's basically that the model that sort of governs our society, which is basically one of selfishness, survival of the fittest, everyone will be familiar with how that works or doesn't work. This is in fact not natural, and that we're basically cooperative beings, and we certainly get a lot more done when we cooperate. And that's not about everyone merging like the Borg and becoming the same, but it's about the individuals, as we all are. The individual can be celebrated, but that cooperation is the key.
Yes, it's really interesting here because Darwin himself wrote about the survival value of feelings, about when we feel for each other, it bonds us together, and that's given a survival advantage. You know, one saber-toothed tiger versus one human, that certainly in kind of primitive past, the saber-toothed tiger would have won, but they became extinct. And what helped humans survive was our cooperativeness, the fact that we feel for each other, we feel with each other, that when someone else has distress, we can feel distress for them, that distress acts through us. And so when we feel for people, for aspects of our world beyond ourselves, it's that has been part of what's helped us survive. And it's really interesting here around use of words, because rather than survival of the fittest, it's actually survival of those that fit best together, and fit best together with their environment as well. I think this is one of the real keys, that to have an individual organism surviving while its environment is destroyed makes no sense biologically at all, and it wouldn't continue. That organisms that survive are those that work with their environment, particularly if they can play a role where they're giving benefits around, that you get a basis of mutual aid. And there's lots and lots of examples of that in nature, but also a lot of very, very interesting work that's been done around the idea of group survival rather than individual survival. And particularly now, we live in an interconnected world where basically we're all on this planet together, and the idea of having a divided world where the rich and privileged will somehow be okay, basically if we wreck the planet, no one's going to be okay.
There's a phrase in the book which I really liked, and obviously the meaning of it is profound. I might be paraphrasing here, but it was like this, that our sense of self then defines what self-interest is. And if we are out for ourselves, or just those close to us get ahead, trample somebody else down to move forward, then that's going to be our self-interest. We will take certain course of action to achieve that. But if we can redefine and get this wider sense of self, then suddenly it doesn't seem like such a good idea to basically trash the planet systematically.
Yes, and this idea of the difference between a narrow self on the one hand and a wide self on another, I mean, it's actually within everyone's experience that even within families, it's quite common for parents to make enormous sacrifices for their children. And if you're thinking just purely in terms of selfishness, that wouldn't make sense. And some people might say, well, it's all about the selfish gene, but people will help people who aren't biologically related to them. Adoptive parents play an enormous role. That it's not just about genes. There's a key part of our being is about connectedness and belonging, and it's out of connectedness and belonging that we get a sense of purpose in life. And so what we write about in that chapter, A Wider Sense of Self, is the idea that there's a separate self which is just about me, but there's also a connected self which is about the larger we. And that exists on lots of different levels. So there's a connected self when we're connected as part of a family, connected self when we're part of a community, and you can think of it as larger and larger concentric circles, that we are part of larger circles. And when we feel a strong sense of belonging, just as you have it with a team, when you feel a strong sense of connection with a team, you get team spirit. And when there's a strong feeling of team spirit in a team, that whole team tends to thrive. It tends to be a much more enjoyable place to be. People both give and receive support much more readily. And so what we look at with that idea of a wider sense of self is, how would it be to widen ourselves so much that we feel part of the team of life on Earth? If we look at all of life as some huge organisation, part of a team that we belong to. And what happens is when you take that view, you have a very different relationship with the rest of life, that you tend to experience support, belonging and a sense of purpose that really brings us much more to life.
What do you make of I know you touch upon this in the book, the emergence of a connected consciousness, I believe you call it, that the idea, and there's a lot being talked and written about this, that a global consciousness, human consciousness is emerging, coalescing, and that globalization itself, of communications technology in particular, is actually accelerating this, and whether this can be, is a positive change, and whether it's in time to make a positive difference.
Yes, well, I think all of this whole area is what really brings me, I suppose, a lot of optimism, because there's something here about whenever parts come together as a larger whole, you can never predict what new properties that larger whole will have. So you can look at a whole row of atoms and a whole row of molecules, and that gives you no idea at all of what will happen when those atoms and molecules are bound together as a larger cell. Basically, cells have abilities that you just can't predict from looking at the individual atoms and molecules. And in a similar way, when you look at biological systems, that what can happen in an ecosystem is more than you could predict from just looking at the individual species. But when you look at the whole of life on Earth, what we're looking at here is the term emergence. Emergence is where something new happens as a result of interaction of parts. And we can't predict what will happen if we get to the point where, rather than just being so many separate individual humans, that we were to start thinking of ourselves as part of something larger and acting in that more coordinated way. And I'm very interested in a whole approach within science called distributed intelligence. And the distributed intelligence is where it's not like one part is super brainy and controls everyone else, but it's where lots of smaller parts acting sometimes on quite simple rules or quite simple principles, that there's a higher level of intelligence that emerges out of that. And I've spent decades as a group therapist, really, and one of the things I'm very aware of in groups is that there's something that you can feel happening in groups when there's a development from just a room full of separate individuals to the feeling of community that happens when a group bonds together. And it's what has incredible healing powers. I'm really struck by how I've seen people change and how I've experienced being changed myself as a result of powerful experiences in groups. Now, that's just on a very small scale, where the life of a group, the potential of a group, is more than you can predict from knowing everything about every individual within the group. Some of this becomes difficult to explain, but there's a term I use called level shift, and it's a bit like, if you were just to look at an individual brain cell, that would give you no measure at all of the intelligence of a brain. And thinking is something that doesn't happen in individual brain cells by themselves. Thinking happens on a higher level. Thinking is an emergent property. It happens through the brain cells rather than in the brain cells. And if we were to think, what would happen if our planet could think? What would happen if our planet could feel? It would be something that happens through its parts, just as the way a group acts through its members, a society acts through its members. Our whole planet is acting through its different parts, and we're part of our planet. But the key here is that we also have choice. We also have choice about what potential we bring out inside ourselves. And really, I see this is the defining moment of the 21st century. We're at a crossroads as a species, and we can choose to go down the route of getting the best we can for ourselves. And I think what will happen is, as we do that, we will just gobble up all the resources and we will just fight over what remains. Or we can choose a different route. We can say, here we are, we're at a crisis point, and crisis can become a turning point. And particularly if we wake up to this idea that we're not just separate bundles of selfishness just chasing after our own glory, but we can see that we are part of, belonging to, connected with a most amazing entity of life on Earth. And we're only just beginning to kind of discover quite what that can mean for ourselves. But when we live the life of a connected part, of belonging to something larger, it takes our life in a whole new direction. And that's what we try to describe in Find Your Power. The middle section of the book we call Seeing with New Eyes. It's about living a new story. And the work that reconnects is really about empowerment through plugging in. And what I mean by plugging in, I think of it as of connecting with our root system. You know, a tree with no roots just gets blown down really quickly. But if we can experience our rootedness within the larger life of which we're part, it energizes us, it nourishes us, and it resources us in a way that so much more becomes possible.
Well, a narrow view of time that we referred to earlier, as you say in the book, it diminishes meaning and purpose, and those are the things, the two things that will actually make life worth living, because what's what people are looking for. You know, they're looking for meaning, like what's this for, purpose, what do I do? And there's a lot of people who are not living their true purpose, who don't know what it is and probably never ask themselves and maybe never will. But that wider view of time, then an individual human life becomes very important, but very important in the grand scheme of things. It's not the be all and end all. And this is what the indigenous people understand, that, you know, that what came before and what came after, that we're part of that cycle, and it is up to us to live like we are, and not just as this a little blip here where we just chase the, you know, worldly pleasures and then we check out.
Yes, and it's seeing ourselves, we're the connecting point. We're the connecting point between the past and the future, and what we do shapes what kind of future happens. So that's a great responsibility, really. It's like, but it, you know, we don't control the whole thing, but what we do is we vote. We vote for the kind of future we leave behind, and it's really about, do we leave a curse on the planet or do we leave a positive legacy? And the closest parallel I see to this, I don't know whether, Greg, you've seen the film Avatar, but we wrote about Avatar in the beginning of chapter 5 on when we talk about self, because the view of the Na'vi, the species in Avatar, the blue-skinned, tall species, that they think of themselves, feel of themselves as part of the planet they belong to. It's like they have an intimate relationship with the whole world around them. They see themselves as kind of like caretakers, belong to. They take what they need, but there's a feeling of love, of affection, of real relatedness to the world around them. And I was so struck by, in that film, how the main character of, he changed. He changed through the film, and he changed in his view of himself. That he began the film kind of, you know, in his own kind of little world and feeling kind of limited in a way. But the change in the main character of the film is kind of similar to the change that can happen in ourselves, from seeing ourselves as separate without really much meaning or purpose or direction in life, to feeling this huge sense of that, you know, that we are born at a crucial point in history where we can play a role in the kind of direction that human life moves in.
Now, at this stage, you touch upon something in the book which is actually a very good example of people coming together and making things happen with an eye to the future and the sort of future that they want to have, and the sort of future that we're going to get and going to have to deal with, and that's the transition networks. People may or may not have heard of transition towns. There's I don't know how many there are in the UK, actually. I don't even know if they exist elsewhere. I've only begun to look into it. But without perhaps spending a long time talking about what the transition networks are actually doing, I mean, it's worth mentioning just as an example of action being taken, positive, proactive change occurring.
Absolutely. I see the transition movement as one of the most inspiring examples of what I think of as the Great Turning. The Great Turning is that larger story of noticing what's going wrong in our world and becoming part of the larger turning towards recovery. And I love this term recovery. The recovery isn't just in an individual level, but it also happens in communities and society as a whole. And what the transition movement is really around is resilience, really. Resilience is saying that we're facing shocks, and one of the shocks that we're going to be facing increasingly over the next few decades is that we're running out of oil, that we're moving past the point where the maximum oil production, and just as already in the North Sea and in North America and other parts of the world, the peak of oil production happened some years ago. I think it was about 1999 for North Sea, and there's been less oil being pumped out of the North Sea each year since then. It's in decline. When we get to the point where our global oil reserves as a whole are in decline and we're getting less oil each year, that's going to push the price of oil up, and the whole economy is so dependent on oil that that's going to cause a slowing down of the economy in a way that the recession that we're experiencing at the moment is really just the beginning, really, that there's going to be a contraction of our global economies. This idea, this is a situation we could easily be facing in the coming years and decades. And resilience is about, well, how do we have communities that can still continue to flourish even through those shocks? And it's not just the shock of oil prices going up, but it'll also be all of the kind of economic shocks that are very much here already with kind of rising unemployment, and also the shocks of climate change too. So how do we become resilient as communities? And one of the ways that we do that is by acting together as communities, by looking at questions like, well, when oil is 3 times as expensive as it is now, and that's not such an unlikely thing to happen in the next, in the coming years, how are we going to afford to get our food? And so much of food is transported sometimes thousands of miles. We won't be able to sustain that. So this idea that they actually use the idea of energy vulnerability audits, where you look at, well, how is this community going to survive when the price of oil goes up 30%, 50%, 100%? What can we do? How will our education system function? How will our transport system function? And by looking at those questions now, we can actually design in and develop systems of doing things that will be able to keep going even when a lot of the conventional structures that we rely on now start to fall down.
Yes, I think, and I hope that people will look at if they haven't already, look at the transition town movement and perhaps feel inspired by it to do something similar or something else constructive. And you do stress in the book, in the section going forth, that it's important to have an inspiring vision for the future, because if all we see is bleakness and blackness, well, we're going to find it very difficult to be motivated to act. And it's not, envisioning a future that we might want and just saying, oh, well, that's fairyland, it can't be done. The other side of that coin is, well, if you don't have a shape for something, how can you build it?
Yes, and this idea of dismissing things as just fairy tales, we have a chapter called Daring to Believe It's Possible. And one of the things we look at there is just that there's so many things that we take for granted now as just normal aspects of our life that were dismissed as fairy tales in the past. I mean, I remember, for example, Margaret Thatcher, when she was Prime Minister, saying that anyone who thinks the ANC, the African National Congress, can run, be in charge of South Africa is in cloud cuckoo land. And that was a point when the ANC was basically a banned organisation in South Africa, and Nelson Mandela was in prison. Yet, we all know now that Nelson Mandela, he's kind of basically respected as one of the most important statespeople of the last 100 years. He's had an enormous effect on the world. He became president of South Africa. Now that wouldn't have been seen to be possible earlier in time. And there's lots of examples of that. Women getting the vote in many countries of the world. There was a time when that wasn't seen to be at all likely. The idea of somebody from African American background becoming president of the United States. A lot of these things would be seen to be in cloud cuckoo land. And so when we get told, if we have an idea, oh, that's never going to happen, that's just dreaming, it's possible that that's true, but it's also possible that it can happen. We don't know what's possible. So if we don't know what's possible, then what's important is what's desirable. What do we want to happen, and how do we become part of the story of making that more likely?
And there's towards the end of the book, there's 2 sort of little themes that on the face of it seem negative, but you actually show how underlying them is actually a positive. One is the idea of uncertainty. and the other's something you call discontinuous change. And that would basically mean that things can be plodding along and then suddenly, seemingly without warning, can radically change. And people would normally think of negative examples of that, financial crash, for example. But when you consider then that we're always looking for certainty in our lives, but actually that's an illusion, because all there is uncertainty. There's that expression, that the only things that are certain is death and taxes. So when you understand that all is uncertainty, and that discontinuous change can also mean something suddenly changing for the better, a critical mass of people saying or believing or doing something, and then suddenly overnight things change for the better. When you take that on board, it's a different way of looking at things that can be quite empowering.
Yes, and other terms for discontinuous change is a breakthrough. Before a breakthrough happens, something can seem impossible, and yet when you have a breakthrough, there's like a sudden moving through to a whole new realm. Or another term is a quantum shift, and I see this a lot happening with individual change in addictions recovery. That somebody might have been stuck for years and years in a belief that I'll never make it. I'm just one of those people. It's not going to happen or I haven't got enough willpower, or whatever the story is. And yet situations can change where people can end up doing something, finding a new way forward, where like all of a sudden something becomes possible. And I lose count of the number of people I've worked with who were dismissed as hopeless cases, but then who found stable long-term recovery after a period of breakthrough. And when I run groups on resilience and empowerment, a question I often ask is, how many people in the room can do something now that some years ago you thought, I could never do that, that's just not possible for me? And every time I've asked that question, hands always go up. There's always someone in the room who says, yeah, that's true for me. And a whole variety of different situations. It might be, I was somebody who used to smoke and I thought I'd never be able to give up. I tried 25 times and every time I tried I failed. And I just thought, I'm just one of those people who will never make it. And then something happened. It's like maybe a series of things happened, or I found a new way and I had a breakthrough, and now I haven't smoked for the last 10 years. Or it might be learning to swim or learning to drive or whatever it is. So that's common human experience, that we can have the sense that something can't be done, and we can be absolutely certain of that, but then situations can change. And if we're aware of that process, if we were aware that when we say something's impossible, that's an assessment made at a particular point in time based on what we know in that time, and that assessment of whether something's possible or impossible can change as we become aware of new information or as we develop new capacities.
Well, just to begin to round things up, I have to say that I'm not a believer in mindless optimism any more than I am in hopeless pessimism. Both, actually, if you think about it, are rooted in certainty, or a need for certainty. But even if things are as bad as the worst doom mongers say, I would say if you had 100 to 1 chance of personal survival, would you take it? So if someone said, here's 100 boxes, inside one of them is the key to your survival, you can choose a box or you cannot choose a box. If you don't choose a box, you die. You choose a box, 100 to 1, one of them's got the key. Of course you would take it. You wouldn't say, oh, well, it's 100 to 1. It's a bit unlikely that, that it's quite an uphill road. We face a lot of challenges. I think I'll just sit at home.
And I think what's even more than that, I'm very interested in the psychology of happiness, and it's something I've done a lot of work around. And one of the ways to have a much more satisfying life is when you're engaged in a process that kind of fully absorbs your attention, but also if what you're absorbed in has meaning for you. And so I'd say if you get really interested in looking in boxes, then you wouldn't get and you find a way of dealing with failure where you think of each unsuccessful attempt as just another step on the way. So it's not like, oh, I've looked in one box and it wasn't there, so what's the point? Or I've looked in 5 boxes, it wasn't there, what's the point? You just recognise that the way to find a way forward is to be involved in the quest of looking. And if you're involved in the quest of looking for a way, then your life becomes an adventure. And something about making our lives adventures, actually, it enlivens us. And adventures, the really best adventures, they're not solo missions. They tend to be a merry gang, and you tend to have a group of people, whether it's, Harry Potter with Ron and Hermione, or Frodo and the Fellowship of the Ring. We can create those groups around us, and that when we do have a sense of fellowship, that there are others who are joined with us in a similar direction, then the whole process of working for change becomes much more satisfying. And what one of our last chapters, we call it Maintaining Energy and Enthusiasm. And it's really about changing the story of activism. Activism, we see, is where you're active for something bigger than you are. That when you're active for a purpose that's important to you, but when it's not a solo mission, when you've got others who are on a journey of shared purpose, it actually is one of the best recipes for a satisfying life. And so I'd see this is the new good life. If you want to have a really good life, you want to have a satisfying life, get involved in a story that means something to you. And what bigger story is there really than, here we are at the beginning of the 21st century, and like many other adventure stories, begins from a place of a lot of very disturbing things happening, and some of them may even seem kind of hopeless and beyond our ability to respond. But what makes a great adventure story is not being put off by difficult odds, that we rise to the occasion and we connect up with others who are also rising to the occasion. And we begin this quest of looking for insights and allies and implements and practices that will help us give our very best response to the challenges that we face. And when we really rise to the occasion and play our best part, I'd say that's the way to have the best life possible.
Well, I think that's a very positive note on which to end. Now, the book we've been discussing, Active Hope, How to Face the Mess We're In Without Going Crazy, that's available widely, all the usual outlets. But to close off, would you care to tell the listeners anything about your website, any other publications you have? I know you run workshops and give talks. Just anything you'd like to share, really.
Yes, well, I've got a website at chrisjohnstone.info, and that's Johnstone, JOHNSTONE.info. We've also set up a website at activehope.info, which gives information about the book. I run workshops. In fact, I've just recently moved to the north of Scotland, where I've set up a distant learning college called the Centre for Resilience, Happiness and Positive Change, really looking at how we train ourselves to get better at strengthening our resilience, living lives that are deeply satisfying, through also engaging in positive change, finding our contribution to the world. And we've got a website at resiliencehappiness.change.com. So those are some things that I point people towards. And in fact, we're running a distance learning course linked to the book. It's an Active Hope training, and it begins at the beginning of November. And the idea is we get a group of people reading the book together, but also meeting once a week for a weekly webinar where we go into it in more detail, we discuss it, and actually together use some of the exercises and practices that we describe, really about how do we train ourselves to give our best response that we think of as our gift of active hope to the world situation we face.
Well, Chris, thank you very much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for another week. As always, thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to find out more about the issues discussed today and Chris's work in general, you'll find links to both activehope.info and chrisjohnstone.info on the programme page for this show. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizefreedom.com.